Dr. Claud Anderson, who's founder and president of the Harvest Institute in Washington, D.C. He's the author of several books, The Black Labor and White Wealth, and his latest book, Dirty Little Secrets. It was a book about Black history, its heroes, its troublemakers. The reason why Claud Anderson has been invited to participate on this Issues and Answers show today is because he is qualified. He has been appointed as the Assistant Secretary to the Department of Commerce. He was the chair of the Board of Governors for Southeastern United States Economic Development. He was the Secretary of Education for the state of Florida. And he was the leader of the Action Council that played a very prominent role in helping Jimmy Carter win his first primary. And he was also instrumental in planning for the Democratic National Convention and playing a role with the Democratic Party. Dr. Anderson, you are uniquely qualified to discuss the question of race. Very briefly, before we get into other topics, will you tell our viewers what, in a nutshell, is racism?
As briefly as I can give it to you, racism, unfortunately, is not what we've been focusing on, Paul. It's not a social issue. It's an economic issue. Racism never existed on Earth until the enslavement of black folk, the commercialized enslavement of black folk in the 14th century. Racism is a group phenomenon where one group has acquired so much power, wealth, and resources that they can exploit, Jim Crow, enslave another group of people. It is a competitive situation between groups of people. That's the first thing. Secondly, we need to understand that black folk have never been able to practice racism in this country because we don't own and control a sufficient amount of anything to be a racist. So contrary to what you might hear occasionally on TV where they call a black a racist or Farrakhan a racist, a black person cannot be a racist.
You spoke about what we hear on TV. How would you suggest to our audience and to America how we should frame a debate on this issue on this discussion of race? How should we frame it?
It should be framed in the context of a definition of the word. The root word of racism is race, R-A-C-E. That means race means to be in competition with. It means to be in a contest. Black folk are now competing between whites and blacks. It means there'll be a winner and a loser. Black folk have never been able to compete. And so consequently, if whites have all the resources and blacks have been denied the resource, they're not in a competitive posture to be able to compete with white folks. And when you talk about structural racism, that means that someone has control of so much wealth, power, and resources that black folk are being intentionally excluded out of a competitive posture.
Okay. Congressman Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, and Congressman Tom Campbell from California is now launching this whole discussion that we should focus more on individual rights and individual concerns rather than concerns of race and affirmative action. What do you say about that?
But first of all, they would never touch racism. Racism will run over individualism 1,000 times with nothing left over. Now, the reason whites like to focus on individualism, because they can't, as I just said to you, they cannot be the victim of racism, so they don't understand racism. And that's why in the Constitution it focused on individual this and individual rights. At the same time that was focusing on individual rights, the drafters of the Constitution of the United States, they collectively owned over 1,400 slaves. So they weren't talking about blacks. See, blacks were enslaved as a group. But whites were talking in the Constitution about individualism, and they love to continue to talk about individualism. But black folk must come to understand that their strength, their power, and their group and their wealth potentials rest in their group cohesiveness. They must function as a group. The potentials of a group will spell out and determine your potentials in the society. You can have no more power than your group has.
Okay, well, how do we address, speaking of all these groups, how do we address the issue of race for the black group when there's so many other ethnic groups that are growing in the country? And how do we sort ourselves out? And how do we find a way to focus?
Well, the first thing, we must never compare or equate ethnicity with race. Those are totally two separate things. See, those ethnic groups that you're talking about, by and large, are subcategories of the European race itself. And so consequently, what we see as ethnicity, you'll find out that all those individuals can be French, German, Italians, Greeks, but they are still classified as whites in our society. Every group of individuals who come into this country as immigrants have been classified as whites, except Asians, and Asians are now on probation to be very soon classified as whites. The definition of whiteness in America continues to change and expand to make sure that whites stay in the majority population. And so the contest will always be between blacks and whites. That was the origin of racism. Racism never existed, as I said, until the 14th century, and it is a competitive situation between blacks and whites.
What do you say to high school students in Oakland or around the country when they're trying to figure out how do they sort out blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, and women in the discussion of the context of affirmative action?
They must understand that that is a dilution process. See, no one, Paul, has ever enslaved and Jim Crowed women, Asians, Hispanics, handicapped, midgets, anyone else. It's the only people have been systematically and customarily excluded out of the economic system, the political system, and the education system has been black folk. So what you got going on in this country now is a conscientious, programmed effort to make sure that anything pertaining to black folk is watered down and diluted and equated out by including everyone else. There's a cardinal rule in social dynamics that says everything that pertains to everybody doesn't pertain to anybody. So what they want to try to do is to make sure that the dominant society feels no guilt and no responsibility for the conditions of black folk by equating it to all these other groups.
Do you think that the dominant society should feel some guilt?
Yes, most definitely they should feel
And
guilty.
what about, I was riding on the BART train the other day, reading I think it was a Muslim newspaper, and a white man leaned over and said that slavery happened so long ago, and that he wasn't personally responsible, that maybe his great-great-great-grandfather might have participated in it. Why don't we just forget about it? Since he's not personally responsible, why are we holding him responsible?
For a number of reasons. First of all, that's a very, very naive and unwitting position for him to take. He is responsible because he's still enjoying the fruits and advantage of what his great-grandfather and great-grandparents did to black folk. He's living an advantaged lifestyle that comes from the enslavement and the Jim Crowism of black folk. In other words, it's like if I were to put a mortgage on a house and I pass that house on through inheritance to you and you receive that house, there's a bill to go along with it. And for what has happened to black folk in this country, there's a bill attached. And just as Indians laid a claim against the land in America, and that's why we're giving Indians reparations in this country. We've been giving Indians reparations now for over 300 some years because the Indians said, we have laid a claim against this land for what you did to us.
Are you implying that they should give reparations to black people?
Most definitely. And black folks should be coming back now laying a legal claim against the government. Because you see, you never could have had enslavement and Jim Crow in this country for 460 years without the complicity or without the support of government. Every level of government, city, state, county, federal government has participated. They're all co-equal guilty in the fact that they have created these conditions for black folk. And the conditions were not social, they were economic.
Do you have a specific concept outline of a proposal of what reparations requests would look like?
Oh, I got a lot of things. First of all, first thing I would ask for is that, contrary to what everybody said, always talking about how bad off Indians are, I said, fine, if Indians are that bad off, treat black folk the way you treat Indians. I want the same status that Indians have. So I won't have to pay any taxes. I can get free land. I can get, free health care. I can have a federal Indian bureau. I want a federal black bureau, where the Federal Indian Bureau in Washington, D.C. now appropriates on an actuality of about $26,000 a year for every Indian in the United States. When the largest tribe of Indians in the United States, let's take the Cherokee, you got about 150,000 Cherokee Indians. The United States government gives them approximately $170 million a year. I want to be treated like Indians. And what I want this country to do is to classify blacks the same way you classified Indians, put them into a special category, and then turn around and give us land. We got a lot of land in the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Internal Affairs, land ownership. I want black folk to go to those land bureaus and get land in this country. We never got to 40 acres and you give us that land. I want black folk to also be eligible to be able to get to build gambling casinos on any land I can define as black land. Declassify all the ghettos in the United States. And now saying that any blacks living in those ghettos are now exempt from taxes, and second, they can build casinos in there, just like Indians can. Now, the Indians right now got 237 reservations in the United States. They now have 252 casinos. Those casinos bring in profits alone, somewhere between $6 and $9 billion a year. Now, that is more money, Paul, than all 500,000 black businesses in the United States put together. So classify my people as Indians if Indians are so bad off. And I want reparations like Indians.
What about the congressman from Ohio that passed this thing that said that America ought to apologize. And they passed, remember that bill
Yeah.
where it said that we are sorry? Do you think apology is connected or should be connected to reparations, or is it relevant?
Yeah, it is very relevant and it's very necessary. Because what it does, it acknowledges something that's been done to black folks. See, right now, they don't want to apologize because for one very specific reason. It would violate the current public policy on black folk. See, and let me take a second to go back to that, okay? Now, see, the historical public policy on black folks started in 1666. They had a public policy on black folk from 1666 until 1966. That 1666 public policy on black folk was called enslavement laws. And that's when all the states began to enslave black folk in 1666. That public policy says black folk in America should be defined as an excluded, subordinated, non-compensated, non-competitive workforce for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. Let me repeat that so your listeners be able to understand what I'm saying. The public policy that was initiated first on blacks in 1666 that came out of the doctrine of exclusion. It says that black folk in America should constitute an excluded, subordinated, non-compensated, non-competitive work group, a labor force for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. Now, that policy stayed in effect for 300 years, from 1666 to 1966. In 1966, black folk became obsolete as a labor class. For the first time in this nation, right at the conclusion of the civil rights movement, ironically, black folk became an obsolete labor force.
So you're saying that the 13th, 14th Amendments and the 15th Amendment were irrelevant?
At this point in time, yes, because we're not using it appropriately. When black folk became obsolete in 1966, Paul, what happened, the public policy on black folks shifted then. Since whites now had computer-driven equipment, they no longer needed blacks to open doors, shine shoes, wash dishes, do anything. They then picked up a computer that could do the same thing. So now to alleviate themselves of any obligation to black folk, they passed a new public policy on black folk. And the new public policy, which is still currently in effect in this country, says this, that white folks should feel no guilt for what's happened to black folk, no responsibility for what's happened to black folk or their conditions, and thirdly, they will accept, support, nor or advocate any programs that will redistribute the wealth and resource and power back into the hands of black folk. Because at that point in time, whites in America in 1966 had become 50-foot economic giants, and black folks were 1-foot midgets.
Have you heard of Mr. Ward Connolly?
I've heard the name, yes.
Have you ever had an occasion to appear on a program with him?
No, I have not.
Have you ever thought about debating him?
Well, I could think about debating, but I don't usually debate people for a very specific reason, because I figure most of my opinions are personal opinions, and therefore they're not subject to debate. Secondly, I learned one thing in life a long time ago in all my years in business and politics, is that if I can't convince somebody of the rightness and the accuracy and the timeliness of what I'm saying in 5 minutes, it's a waste of time. Because I mess around with them, they get me to thinking the way they're going, I'll be going backwards too.
Well, I want to know if you could convince me in 1 minute about the Dred Scott decision, to see if it's related to the controversies of racism today and whether the issue of apology of blacks and slavery, and that whole apology for slavery context. Can you briefly tell our viewers what the essence of the Dred Scott decision was, and is that in context related to today's need for an apology?
Yes, it is. The Dred Scott decision came out of a situation where you had a black man and his wife had left Missouri and went out of the state for a number of years and worked in labor for a white person. And they went back to Missouri, and he claimed that since he's been out of the state, he'd been in free territory, that in fact he was free. And he just should not have to be returned back to a labor or a subordinated or enforced labor status. And he filed a lawsuit in that effect that went into the federal courts. In 1857, the court ruled that as a black man, since it was an economic issue, that the white man had vested rights. He had investments. He had put money into that black man, so therefore that black man was property based on the Constitution of the United States that defined black people as a slave article, that they have no rights. And so the Dred Scott decision reinforced the United States Constitution, which says black folk are objects of labor, that they are not human beings, that therefore they have no rights. And that was an economic decision. Now, what was supposed to have countered the Dred Scott decision, Paul, was the first Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was put out by, which was promoted, I guess, by Congressman Thaddeus Stevens and Sumter. And what they said to reverse the Dred Scott decision was that said that you cannot free blacks You cannot turn blacks loose in the society unless you redistribute some of the wealth and resources to them. What they said is that either a black man's going to be a slave or he's going to be free. But without resources, the empowerment tools, without money, he is still a slave. And they approved that through the United States Congress in 1866. It was vetoed by Andrew Johnson, who came on later, vetoed it. But then Thaddeus Stevens and Sumner went back to the House of Representatives and got it reapproved again, which is still in effect. And what they said is that black folks' rights in this country is an economic right, not a social right, not a civil rights. But then the 14th Amendment came up in 1868. They watered it down at that point in time just to get it enacted into the Constitution. And that time they left out all the economic rights, but the civil rights law is still in effect. And unfortunately, the white power structure in this country and the black power structure has never gone back to the original intent of overriding the Dred Scott decision with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which says that the problem between blacks and whites is economic. It's not social, it's not political, it's not integration.
Speaking of 1866 and that time, I see you have this book here called Dirty Little Secrets.
Right.
And a previous guest on Issues and Answers was named Reverend John Collins. And he wrote a book on America's Best Kept Secrets. And his book deals with the thesis about the Freedmen's Bank. And you were talking about economics and freedom and the economic. Could you comment on the Freedmen's Bank, on how his thesis is that white Americans set up this Freedmen's Bank and propped up Douglas to take it over after it had failed. And in fact, even though it was a black bank, most of the loans went to white folk. Did you know anything about that historically?
Well, what happened with if you go back to the whole Freedman Thrust and the Freedman Bureau came out of that 1866 first Civil Rights Act. And the primary purpose there again was to bring about economic reparation for black folk in this country. But what happened it only stayed in existence for about 6 years, functioned for about 6 years. So by the early 1870s, it was out of existence. But even in that whole thrust, what they did, they didn't focus on economics for black folk. What they focused on was just education, because the black codes went into effect, and the conservative whites in this country killed the 14th Amendment. They killed the Civil Rights Act and said that best we're going to give black folk is an educational opportunity. So they created these schools, these black schools across the country. But now, what Frederick Douglass got was an opportunity to do something in the banking industry, but he was one of the few that got a chance to do that. But that was sponsored and supported by white money, just like Howard University came out. See, Howard University came out at the same time. Howard University was not initially created for black folk. It was created for the white mulatto offsprings of white congressmen coming into Washington, D.C. That's why they were the only black school that was permitted to have a medical school and a law school. No other black school could have a medical school or law school, because I just told you in the national public policy was that black folk could never be competitive with white folk. You could not teach and train black kids to compete with white kids. Now, black schools were to teach black kids to be things like social workers, athletes, or band players, or teachers.
So do you think that integration, this whole move towards integration, you were talking about this focus on education, is that a positive thing or is it a negative thing? And how do we deal with this notion of busing and people chasing people to the suburbs, looking for an opportunity to sit next to them to get educated?
Well, see, to be perfectly honest, even though I got enough degrees in human behavior and dynamics and sociology, I don't even understand that thrust. Because, see, integration itself is countermanding any possibility of you ever acquiring power and wealth. You cannot empower yourself at the same time you integrate. Integration, Paul, means disintegration. It means reducing yourself to a micro speck. Because in a society where the majority will win and rule and the minority will lose and suffer, why would anybody want to integrate? Integration is making black folk a guest. Integration means I will make you a guest. I will make you a guest in something that's owned and controlled by other people. I'll make you a guest in white suburbs, in white schools, in white businesses, in white organizations, in the white government. See, black folk can never acquire wealth and power as long as they're integrating. And what's going to happen, though, with this whole concept of integration, is going to hold blacks in abeyance until these other groups, competing groups, come in and wipe them out and push them into a subclass structure. Now, you mentioned the busings, for instance. See, that's one of the dumbest things I've ever seen happen. And see, my family, as an example, was a part of the family that's only black bus line that you've ever had in America. The only black chartered bus line you've ever had in America. And that was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. That was a safe bus company. We didn't have just one bus, 3 buses, 5 buses, or 10 buses. We had over 500 buses. And our buses didn't just service the black neighborhoods. They serviced the black neighborhoods and the white neighborhoods, period. We put the white bus company out of business there. I mean, that was a Duke Power Company. Duke Power Company, named just like Duke University, and Duke Electric Company. We put them out of business because we ran a very competitive bus line. Now, our bus line was vertically integrated for black folk, which gave us a power base, a wealth base, an employment base. We hired our own people. We bought our own buses, repaired our own buses, operated our own buses, had our own drivers, our own mechanics, and we serviced both neighborhoods. But what put us out of business was not our inability for us to compete. It was the fact that blacks decided to integrate down in Montgomery. And when Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks integrated the buses there, rather than going in and buying the bus line from the whites and taking it over and operating it under black control, they decided that it was much better in the context of integration, which was social. Let's just socialize with whites. If whites are sitting on the front of the bus and we sit on the back, let's move up front with them and let's integrate with them. Let's intermix and make it a social issue. And so black folk then moved from the back of the bus to the front of the bus. Like, who really cares?
There is a growing number.
But let me finish the point now. Now, here's what happened now. But when that movement moved up to North Carolina, and came to North Carolina, the blacks in North Carolina says, we also want to sit on the front of the bus. And in North Carolina, we said, but we don't have any white buses you can sit on the front of the white bus. They said, well, why don't you all get some white buses so we can sit on the front of them? So our bus company went out of business. So then they brought in white buses. Now whites run the bus line. And the same thing happened to our black cab companies and our black movie theaters and our black restaurants. Everything black went out of existence because black folks see integration as being a social issue, and somehow they feel if they get closer to the white society, they're elevating their status, and they're not. They're disintegrating.